you wanted to come in and talk to us about your organization's
Right.
work, and we're interested in, especially in the insights that you gleaned on Florida and how
Right.
Florida is doing compared with other states.
Yeah, just step back one little bit. I do want to talk about the importance of teacher preparation, and not just what my organization is doing, but you know, we like to think we've been very instrumental in making it more of a national issue than it had been, but we're seeing sweeping change. Well, I don't know if I'd call them sweeping. We're seeing states beginning to make beef up their accountability systems. So there are 33 some states, including Florida, which have passed significant policies in the past few years. In response to what everybody acknowledges, it's a mediocre industry. You know, and it's not meeting the needs of public schools. So Florida, I would say, has almost a perfect set of policies on paper. You're seeing, you know, they require teacher preparation candidates have to pass a reading test. As of this spring, they're going to have to pass a rigorous math test. As of this spring, some of their content for elementary teachers is weak, but it's not the worst we've seen by any measure. And they're not making it selective enough to get into a school of ed. But across the board, you're seeing a state where you'd like to say, well, if this is all about policy, then you're 80% of the way there, right? Well, it's not all about policy. It's a lot about the practice. So Florida has 49 approved programs. That means the state says, okay, you can prepare people to teach at the Florida license. And when we go in and look at what they're actually doing in their coursework and the degree to which it aligns with policy, it's rather remarkable how little it does. You know, so the state puts in a pretty rigorous reading expectations, but then when we go and take a look at the reading coursework, we'll see, you know, half the institutions make no reference to the most effective methods of reading instruction that the law requires them to teach. And they're used to wiggling out of these things. The state doesn't, I don't know whether the state collects course syllabi or visits courses or whatever, but you know, we're doing a review of the books and the syllabi and saying, are you adhering to the law in your own state, and finding they're not. So all this is trying to say is that there is a real issue with what's going on the ground with these programs. And states are beginning to get it. Florida certainly more so than most. But we've got to attend what's going on with higher education. And traditionally, it's hands-off on higher ed. But we're seeing some movement. We're seeing some movement to reverse that. But higher ed has gotten basically a free pass in terms of accountability, and that, you know, so at least in this area, that has to be changed. But you know, Florida could pass every law under the sun. The problem is enforcement. The problem is, you know, you need higher ed to buy into some of this stuff. Right now, they just don't buy in.
May I ask how your organization did its evaluation of Florida schools?
So we look across a whole range of training areas. 18, 19, we're adding one, so that'll come out in the fall. That's the 19th. So we look at 4 buckets: how selective the programs are, and we don't mean are they making. And Florida has a real problem in that area. I mean, it's a particularly unselective state with its higher ed. I think it's one of the few states that doesn't. I think it maybe has one very selective college or university, but doesn't have a good distribution of selectivity. But we're not looking to see if they are Harvard or Yale. We're looking to see if they have a standard that says if to go into teaching, you need to be in the upper half of your college attending class. And we find that half of them don't have that. And this is, what I'm giving you is data that is not for release until the middle of June. So when I reference, you can use last year's data, which says much the same thing, but any new data, I have to ask you to respect the embargo on that until the middle of June. So we look at selectivity, we look at content knowledge preparation. All right, so we want to see for middle and high school majors, are they having it a subject in their in what they're going to teach? And most institutions do that, but I'll give you an example of the complexity here and why it gets ignored. So people need science teachers in high school. Well, so somebody goes and becomes a teacher to teach high school science, and they take mostly biology courses, and the general science test that they pass is something that if they do really well in one area, that compensates for all the other areas. So they may have flunked the chemistry and physics section of the test, but they did really well in biology, and they're qualified to teach all subjects. So there's that kind of problem. And at the elementary level, especially with the Common Core, where and I know Florida has its own version of the Common Core, but where you're expected to bring a lot more nonfiction into the English language arts, so you need teachers who have a pretty good grasp of science and history and geography. We see very little attention on the part of higher ed and making sure teachers are getting that. I mean, you can become a psych major and never take a science course, never take a history course to become an elementary teacher. I'd say the finding I think is most disturbing for, and it's going to show up in the test this year that Florida is implementing, and that's math performance of elementary teachers. We did not have a single institution in that we looked at that require sufficient math courses and of the caliber they need to be. So we look at all this coursework, then we look at the practice, we look at student teaching. We want to see what they communicate to a school district. You know, so we go ahead and we do a freedom of information request of all the school districts, and we say, tell us what the institution requires of your classroom teachers who agree to be the mentor of the student teacher. Are they required to be an effective teacher? And whereas I believe there may be a law in Florida where you have to be effective. Currently, none of the programs have that requirement. So you're seeing a real mix mash between policy and practice. And then the last area we're looking at is outcomes. The problem we have we want to know if their teachers are more effective. We can't use any of the data in Florida because it's only reported at the institutional level. And so if you're mixing the graduate program with the undergraduate program, the two have nothing in common. So if you're reporting outcome scores for the whole institution, it doesn't do you any good. You don't know really what you're reporting on. It's not useful to the institution, it's not useful to the public, and it's not useful to us. So let me try to think of something good to say.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to circle back to one of the things you said right from the get-go, and that is you said it's a mediocre industry. It's not meeting the needs of public schools. I can imagine that would probably make some folks, some teachers and their union representatives pretty, they would consider those fighting words. What do you, that's a very critical statement. What do you base that on?
Well, first of all, before we even did this work, it was uniformly acknowledged that schools of education were not meeting the needs of public schools. This is not a ding against teachers. Yeah. Many good teachers come out of very bad programs. You know, they learn on their own, they're just naturally talented, they get good mentors in the schools. This is really about what's fair to teachers and what they deserve. But this is an industry that has been widely criticized since the 1930s, but there were books written about it in the 1950s. Secretary Duncan, one of his first speeches when he got into office as U.S. Secretary of Education, as a former superintendent of a public school, was to say we need a revolution in teacher preparation. But let's get down to a little data. So if you look at a distribution curve of performance, okay, and you see how teachers perform based on and disaggregated by how they were trained. So you don't have a board, do you? But here, let me draw it for you. Use my boarding pass. So you look at teachers' performance. Thanks. So, okay, here are teachers here's teacher performance, how their kids do for traditionally trained teachers, okay? Here's how teachers perform who have had almost no training. Here's how teachers performed who are like Teach for America. There's no impact from having been trained. You know, you should see a system where teachers come in who have had 2 years of training and they do this, you know? So we know the hard data shows the lack of value, but also there is, you know, now you can keep your notes. I don't think anybody, I mean, you have the dean at Harvard School of Education saying we need to shut down all but 100 institutions. There's 1,400 institutions in the United States. You need to shut down all but 100. People who are the biggest champions of teacher prep will be very quick to acknowledge that the field is not what it needs to be. So this is not something NCTQ dreamed up. So, but what did we bring to the table? We actually looked at what was happening in the courses. We established how unselective they are. Many of them have admission standards which are actually lower than what an institution requires for you to qualify to play college football. So we have higher standards for college athletes than we do for entry into a school of education. You know, so I don't think what we're saying is, I don't think anyone really disagrees with our results. Though if you talk to, you know, higher ed, they'll probably say that they do. But there's very few people who defend the quality of teacher preparation in the United States. They just don't like how we went about it. You know, they don't like you know, that we were extremely critical and we quantified a problem everybody else had acknowledged.
Well, how should colleges be preparing teachers for today's classroom? Because I'm wondering whether the fact that they are considered not well prepared is based on an old paradigm versus this new data-driven paradigm.
A little bit. You're getting into some issues which I think are fascinating, but maybe more than you want to know. But the field in the 1970s decided it was not their job to train teachers. And that was articulated in writing. It was not Kate Walsh interpreting it. It was like we think a training model is undervalues our role, and our role should be broader. We should be nurturing the professional identity of a teacher. So what they did was they turned their back on a lot of what teachers need to know, like classroom management strategies. So they aren't taught. 99% of all institutions will tell you that they deal with classroom management, they teach it. But then when we go in and look for evidence that teachers are trained in the techniques that are research-based, that every teacher needs to know, in fact, every parent needs to know, the importance of rules and routines and, you know, things that everybody benefits from knowing, those things aren't taught. And we know that because we look at how student teachers are evaluated. So we say, okay, when you get your evaluation from the classroom teacher and from the supervising teacher from the university, what are you held accountable for knowing? And they are rarely held accountable for knowing how to manage a classroom.
But are some of those skills being taught in on-the-job training through practicums rather than actual classroom lectures?
But that's what we looked at. We looked at the practicum.
Okay.
This ends up falling to school districts. This is why, the disconnect between the training, the very pragmatic training that teachers need and deserve, and the very largely theoretical content that is now being delivered explains why, we had 100 school superintendents in the United States endorse what we were doing. I mean, there was no reason for them to expend the political capital and anger their local institutions by endorsing this. We've had every school chief in Florida, and you guys have had a lot in the past 3 or 4 years, endorse this effort. Until we haven't tried to get Pam, I don't think yet, but so if you were to talk to any superintendent in Florida, the Hillsborough superintendent endorsed us, and ask, do they get the teachers the way they need them trained when they start? And they'll tell you no, they don't. It's not a secret.
Now, so you talked about how higher ed, the culture is sort of hands-off higher ed. So would you advocate state lawmakers being much more aggressive in imposing requirements on public universities and colleges with education programs?
Well, first of all, let me be clear that they could just as well impose it on the privates that are training public school teachers,
Okay.
because they're all publicly approved,
All right.
whether they're private or not. Well, that's why I started this morning. Is I'm probably a little bit skeptical about the impact of laws and regulations and their ability to be enforced to the point it makes any real difference. I think there are some things that we outlined that I think are helpful. That you want to make sure that elementary teachers have to pass a test in reading and mathematics, and there are good reading tests and there are bad mathematics tests, and so there are decisions to be made at the state level which are critical, and we go through all those in our report, and we've gone through them in our the Florida yearbook that we produced. But I think I think if this problem is really going to change, it's going to be it has to be owned by the institutions. And right now, public schools tend to give higher ed a free pass. They're kind of intimidated by higher ed. They're not getting the teachers they want, but they keep hiring teachers from those institutions. They don't really know where else to turn, so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give them more information and say, look, if you're not getting the teachers you need, maybe go farther afield than you were otherwise. So there are institutions that are doing a good job. They may not be doing a good job in every area, but maybe you need a really good third grade reading teacher. Here's where you go to get one. And in Florida, that's certainly the case. There are some very good institutions in Florida on reading.
How about the accreditation process?
There's two kinds of accreditation. There's the institutional accreditation, which has absolutely had no impact on quality of teacher training because it's too high level. They're not getting into the issues that are important. Accreditation has been a failure in teacher preparation. It's the only field we can find where more than half the institutions in the country are operating without professional accreditation in their field. So if you look at nursing, engineering, accounting, law, medicine, none of those institutions operate without accreditation. Nobody would, you would not pay tuition for your child to go to them. That's not true in ed schools. Only half of all ed schools have sought accreditation. So it has failed, and they have decided to reinvent accreditation under a new word called CAPE. It was NCATE, and now it's CAPE. And they have new standards, and they're going to be rolling those out in the next few years. I think they are much better than they used to be, but it remains to be seen whether the field takes them seriously and understands that if they can't get accredited, they shouldn't be open.
Well, you guys have had some issues, I guess, with people criticizing your methodology.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that and also about VAM and how that all plays
Yeah.
together?
So, which issue about the methodology? No, data collection or
Right, the
how we
data
did.
collection, yeah.
So we do not give institutions the option to not participate. And the reason for that is that they're publicly approved institutions, and I think they have a right. I think they have a obligation to be transparent. We're not asking for state secrets from these institutions. All we're asking to show is what they're teaching. So if we had left it up to the institutions, we might have had 5% participate. We're trying to create a consumer tool that school districts can use and that aspiring teachers can use. So we will go get materials from schools through students and through faculty when they don't cooperate. We've had to spend, it goes both ways. We've had to spend nearly $300,000, and we're a nonprofit. That's a lot of money for us. We've had to spend $300,000 trying to get we had to hire lawyers in 9 states to get these institutions to comply with their open records laws. And they laugh about it. They say, we'll say, you were charging us $400 or $500 an hour to turn over course syllabi. And they say, yeah, that's the game. I said, well, okay, we can play the game too. We can go get the materials without your permission. I mean, both sides have there's been a lot of antagonism. I'd like to move past that. I think if the institutions are willing to be more transparent, we certainly are culpable in feeding some of the antagonism, but it does go both ways.
How cooperative were Florida schools in the process, the 48 schools or 49 that you mentioned?
Not particularly cooperative. It's interesting. Who's the guy that runs Frank Brogan?
Yeah, used to be
Oh, he's
the higher ed. Yeah, no, he has moved on to the same job in Pennsylvania.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I knew him 10 years ago. He was an education reformer. He was really out there pushing. And so 10 years ago, if he had been a part of this, he would have been on our side, but as a chancellor, not so much. He wrote a pretty critical letter of this effort.
Yeah. Well, I could imagine somebody saying, who do these folks think they are? Who are you to judge our program by your own standards? And I mean, what do you say it sounds like you hear that a lot. What's your response when you get that?
I certainly understand the sensitivity about being evaluated by a self-appointed group, so to speak, but in many ways we are appointed by public educators across the country who stood behind us and said, yes, you need to do this, and we had 75 organizations also endorse what we're doing. So it isn't just a group, this little nonprofit located in DC doing this alone. It's very much with the support of school chiefs around the country. But that said, certainly anybody can do this. Nobody, if anybody else wants to do this, they're free to do it. We just figured out how to do it. We've done it very responsibly, very carefully. We did 10 pilot studies over 8 years before we did the national study. There's a strong research base for where there is research, we use it. Nobody has ever really challenged our standards in terms of whether or not they're good for kids. For example, there is no research that says that you should be trained by an effective cooperating teacher. There is none. We are willing to put our neck out there and say, sorry, but that's kind of important with or without research. I mean, the lack of research in the field is problematic, that's for sure. But we've taken our position. We understand our vulnerabilities, and we try to be extremely responsive. And I think the results speak for themselves. I think that when people take the time to read through our materials and our report, they understand that this has not been done with any sort of axe to grind, or has been done with any sort of determination to blow up the field or anything like that. We very much believe in teacher preparation and very much believe it can be done better.
Looking at the national landscape, are there any states where there is effective vertical integration between the lower education schools and the teacher training programs? Because all these schools that are districts that are putting in reforms to try to make, education better and teachers more effective, is there a state where this is going straight up to where it needs to be at the top, where the teachers are being trained?
That's an excellent question, and the answer is not that we have been able to discern. It's interesting. That's why we are probably a little bit skeptical about the impact of policy, because we looked at states which seem to put a lot of the pieces in place. Like in Texas, they had very good reading regulations about what teachers had to learn. Massachusetts has really good reading tests. We've seen things like that, and then when we go look at the institutions, we're not seeing that buy-in. And so the two sides aren't talking to one another for reasons that I've alluded to a bit. They seem to have been given a free pass. The fact that they're not doing a great job. I went out to Michigan to visit one of the schools that everyone considers to be one of the top in the country. And I said to a group of faculty, why aren't you teaching, I forget what it was, why aren't you teaching what the public schools want you to teach? And they said, well, we don't do this on behalf of public schools. I said, but they're your client. They said, no, they are not our client. So even though they're supplying the professionals for public schools, they don't see that they have to answer to public schools for who they are, how they are preparing them.
That's interesting.
It is interesting. It's not something I can fully understand.
Has anyone ever advanced the argument to you that really what the problem is not shortcomings in teacher education programs, but the pool of people who go into teaching, and the pool would be completely different if they were paid much more?
Oh, I completely agree with that.
Uh-huh.
But I see the problem as twofold. First of all, we absolutely need to make it possible for people who are really talented and effective in the classroom. We need to make it possible for them to earn a really good income. Not bonuses, not little, here's a little pat in the back and give you a $1,500 bonus. That's the wrong way to go about it. They need to make enough money that they can actually take out a mortgage that they can rely on a yearly basis. Until we figure out how to do that well, and some districts are figuring that out, the teacher preparation battle will not be nearly as effective as it needs to be. But that does not, the fact that we need to figure out how to pay teachers who are effective a lot more than they're being paid now, that does not negate the responsibility of higher ed to make their programs attractive places for bright and talented people. So currently, too many schools of education are the fallback major. And when they're a fallback major, you're going to get people who have not given a lot of thought to what they want to do for a living. Ed schools currently admit twice as many elementary candidates as they need across the country. I know Florida tends to import its teachers, but by and large, there are twice as many admitted as need to be. And who cares, right? So what? Well, that has a really detrimental impact on the profession because they're letting people into these programs who are not academically talented, who come from the lower half of the population in terms of academic ability. Coursework gets lowered. It gets a reputation on campus for being Mickey Mouse, or the work we're coming out with in the fall will quantify that. We're going to be comparing the number of students who graduate with honors, sorting them by their major and showing the difference between the education majors, how many of those graduate with very high GPAs versus other majors on the same campus. So it's the easiest program to get into. It's also the easiest program to get out of. So there is something to status, right? People who have a lot of options, especially talented minorities who didn't have this option 50 years ago, and women didn't have this option 50 years ago, so they had to go into teaching or nursing. So when you take all the status away from a profession and you say anybody can get in and, come one, come all, then other people will say, well, I don't want to do something where I'm not going to get paid very much and I'm not going to spend my college education doing coursework, which I think is going to add value.
Well, you were saying that you didn't think merit pay was the way to go, but
I didn't?
I think you were saying that
bonus pay.
That's what we're getting at with that. Well, Florida districts are struggling with their merit pay plans, and one of your reports recommends changing the configuration of raises and earnings potential. How would you suggest Florida schools proceed with this process?
I think it's my understanding from the Florida, the way they're doing this is they're giving bonuses based on how well a teacher did, how well the students did in the most previous year, the most over several years. I just think that is, it's not tackling the problem. First of all, teachers don't leave their A game at home when they don't have a $1,500 bonus dangled in front of them. I mean, it's not going to change how hard I work as a teacher to earn that bonus. What is going to change how hard I work is if I work really hard and it's acknowledged and there is a salary that is commensurate with my contribution to a school district. If the person next to me is going home at 3 o'clock and sort of dials in and doesn't really put much effort into her lesson plans, it's very hard for me to maintain my own commitment. Smart, talented people want to work around other smart and talented people. So I think that the way the state has gone about performance pay, while it's understandable because they were experimenting and trying to figure it out, I think they need to look to some districts which have figured it out and done a pretty good job of the new pay plan in Dallas is, I think, going to be phenomenal. It was already field tested in a sense in a very small district, and the superintendent there went on to Dallas, and he's going to do it there. So you are going to, on the basis of many things, your observations, your multiple measures, not just VAM, you are going to qualify for a higher pay. So that's the way to do it, a salary, not bonuses. As for VAM, it has value, but I don't think, I think it has more value when considering teachers in their aggregate. I think, when you're using the results of a single year's tests, There's a lot of noise in there that it's not fair to the teacher. But actually, one of my biggest problems with VAM is not the actual methodology. It's the test used to decide the VAM measure. So right now in this country, including Florida, we don't have curriculum in place that are linked to the test. I mean, they say they're aligned. The alignment is so loose. So if we had really good curriculum driving a really good test, then the 5th grade teacher would be more than happy to have her scores on the children's scores on that test reflect her performance. But the quality of English language arts tests that teachers are being used to hold teachers accountable are really problematic.
What about the argument from teachers that it's not fair to them that if they're stuck in an urban setting and the children that they're teaching are coming from homes where there are no books, there's no parent participation, is it fair for them to be judged on their performance when these children aren't getting the support they need at home?
I believe that reflects a misunderstanding of what VAM does. VAM controls for those factors. I don't know the methodology that's used in Florida, but it's certainly the case that most good VAM methodologies would account for the child's background. They control that they control for it when the child starts. So I think that when teachers say that, they may not have as full an understanding as would help them to accept VAM as a somewhat legitimate measure, but a legitimate measure that I think has some problems. It has enough problems that this is where I come down on it. It should be considered when you're evaluating a teacher to the extent possible, but I'm not sure that 50% is right. I think 35% is probably in the area you want to look at, and it should be accompanied by things that ought to correlate.
Is there a Florida school, college or university that you would single out that gets it right, that's closer to getting it right and imposing or applying the proper standards for success in teaching?
I don't know. I don't think there is a Florida program in the top. I'm pretty sure there's not a program from Florida. I can give you I purposely don't look at that because I tend to have a big mouth. But I know that half the schools are rankable, which means they're in the upper 50th percentile. So that means half the programs in the state are not rankable. They're below the 50th percentile. I'm pretty certain that Florida does not have a program in the top 20 or so. Oh, there it is. Sorry.
I'm glad you found that.
Pardon?
So I'm glad you found that.
Yeah. Okay.
And how much, there's a lot of discontent within the teaching ranks, as you know, with accountability and all its accoutrements, with standardized testing. How much is that, in your judgment, keeping out people who would otherwise be better qualified teachers?
I don't know. I don't have an informed opinion of that. I know that a lot of states have told me that their admissions are down a bit in some schools of ed. But my sense has been it's been more about the number of pink slips that are handed out on a routine basis to younger teachers. So they do more talking about how they can't seem to get a job. I think Miami-Dade
security.
Yeah, Miami-Dade has done that rather extensively, I believe. I don't know about programs up here. But I think that's been my sense, that that's certainly what's going on in California. They just go through these vicious cycles where everyone that has worked for 3 years or under is getting a pink slip automatically every year, and if you're smart and got a lot of options, you're going to go someplace, or you're going to look for a job where you're not feeling like you're about to lose it every May. But that's, I'm not trying to evade your question, I just don't think I have a very good answer.
Mm-hmm. We get letters from people and sometimes columns from teachers who say, just, let me teach, get out of the way and let me teach, and I will produce the kind of results that everyone wants. It's just it's just all these requirements that I have to pursue, or I have to follow at the state's insistence that prevent me from being an effective teacher.
Well, I think that's a very popular line. You see it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
If I go on the web right now, I could probably find it in 10 places in 2 minutes. We did have that system in place in the United States in the 1980s, in the 90s, to a large extent. Teachers were allowed to teach pretty much whatever they wanted to teach. And the lack of coherence that emanated from that, sure, those teachers who were very talented, and they did accomplish a lot of great things, but who's making the determination that only the really talented teachers get to teach what they want to teach and to get out of their way? We don't even know who's good. Our evaluation systems are so bad across the country that it's impossible to give anybody that kind of free rein, because we don't really have much confidence in a system where 99% of all teachers are rated exemplary. So I don't think we want to return to a system where teachers get to decide, everything they teach. On the other hand, I think, and I'm not one to quote Finland, because I think people get a little tired of hearing about the Finland miracle, but the one thing I think is very encouraging and hopeful for us is that Finland shut down its schools of education in the 1970s, and they reconfigured them. So these aren't working, we got to do it better. And they made it really hard to get into a school of ed. Everybody hears they only take the top 10%. And they do not have anywhere near the level of standardized testing or accountability systems in place as a result. Now, I think those things are very much linked. I think one of the reasons there is so much accountability and so much interference in schools right now is because there is not the confidence that the workforce as a whole can pull off the standards we need for world-class education. That's not to say there aren't many, many teachers who could, but the workforce as a whole cannot drive the engine. So for us to get the profession back to the point where teachers do feel like they have more leeway to decide what's in the best interest of their children and their students, and within the context of a common curricular framework, I don't think it does us any good to have every teacher decide that this is the year we're going to teach dinosaurs, and they never get around to teaching any thing about plant life. So I think there is importance to have some coherence to our curriculum, but I do think that that we would once again realize the kind of freedoms and flexibility that they are now seeking if we are willing to be a lot more demanding about who gets into the profession and how they get trained before they start teaching. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is there any merit to the argument from teachers in states like Connecticut, which score high on the NAEP test, but are now doing the test-based evaluation systems, where they argue that our teachers are now, and our administrators are being inundated and overwhelmed by paperwork and reform mandates and things like that? We were obviously doing a good job before.
Relative. I mean, Massachusetts is the state that does the best job on the NAEP in the country. And has so consistently for a while. I mean, Florida has made tremendous progress. I don't know if I think it's flattened out a bit now, but was making tremendous progress. But I think that if you talk to any of the folks in that state, they would say they're not nearly where they need to be. They're just better. They're the best of a mediocre bunch.
Anything that we didn't ask you, or any points you wanted to leave us with?
Yeah, if I think of something, I'll email you. But
Okay.
I think we've covered it. You guys asked some really good questions.
Good, good.